Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, I'm walking you through Goal 1 of Tennyson Middle School Campus Improvement Plans for the year 2026-2027 school year, our Student Achievement Goal. This presentation comes out of our Comprehensive Need Assessment, CNA, which is a formal process where we pull together everything we know about this campus, our demographics, and our accountability data. Our benchmark results, even our staffing and climate information, and use it to decide whether our limited time and resources should go this year. The CNA is the foundation underneath everything you're gonna see today. Nothing on the slides was decided in a vacuum. What you're going to see in the SMART goal are two objectives underneath it, and the specific strategies our staff will use to move needle this year, along with who's responsible for each one and how we'll know whether it's working. This is being brought to you by the Site-Based Decision Making Committee, SBDM Committee, for your review and input, not as a finished product to rubber stamp, but as a working plan. Your question and your feedback today directly shape how this will get finalized before it goes into our official campus improvement documentation. Here's our roadmap for the next 15 or so minutes. We'll start with the data, what the comprehensive need assessment told us about who our students are and how they are performing. Both were where we're strong and where we're struggling. Then we'll look at goal 1 itself and its two objectives. Objective 1.1 is about grade 7 math specifically, and objective 1.2 is about closing and the achievement gap for our special education population. For each of these two objectives, I'll walk through 3 concrete strategies, what we're doing, who owns it, and how often it happens. After the strategies, we'll zoom out to an implementation summary that lines everything up against the timeline. Then talk about how we're going to monitor progress throughout the year, rather than just waiting for the STAR results in the spring. I'll close with some reflection on this process. We'll including what we'll do differently and where the goal beyond this single year will take us. Last, we'll connect all of this back to what it actually means for a student sitting in a classroom at Tennyson, and then I'll open up the floor for you. Well, the campus data snapshot. This campus data snapshot lets us know who our students are, because every decision in this plan flows from this picture. This data comes strictly and straight from the TAPR, which stands for the Texas Academic Performance Report, which is the state's official records of campus demographic and performance, and it also tracks day-to-day in DMAC and Euphoria Aware. So it's sortable and filterable. If any of you want to dig into specific subgroups, specific grade levels, or specific assessments windows after this meeting, 3 number anchors this picture, and I want to spend a moment on each of one rather than just reading them off the screen. First, 81.9% of our students are economically disadvantaged. That's not just a demographic label, it strips everything from which students have consistent access to internet and devices at home, to who can attend optional tutoring sessions outside school hours, because some kids have families that struggle and cannot bring their students to Saturday intervention sessions or after school support. When we design strategy later in this presentation, you'll notice we lean toward all support happening during the school day precisely because of this number. Second, 61.7% of our students are identified as at risk under the state criteria, which includes factors like prior STAR performance, retention history, and other indicators that state uses to flag students who are statistically more likely to struggle academically. When nearly 2 out of every 3 students on our campus carry the flag, it tells us that the target individual intervention can be in a small site program. It has to be central to how the whole campus operates moving into the regular school day, rather than bolted into the edges of it. Third, our overall campus accountability rate is a C. I want to be direct about this number. Rather than soften it, a C tells us that there's real room to grow. And it's part of why this committee in the room today, working through this planning system of simply renewing last year's plans unchanged. One more piece of context that's easy to overlook is mobility. Students who are continuously enrolled in attendance for the full school year shows measurably lower achievement than students who have been here the whole year. And the mobility rate is tracked separately in the TAPR student information section. This matters because it means our challenges isn't only who our students are on day one, it also whether they get a stable and uninterrupted year with us. That's part of our several of the strategies you'll see today are designed to be picked up by a student joining mid-year rather than assuming every student has been with us since August. Now we're uh, uh, uh. Now we're gonna talk about achievement patterns. So what does this demographic picture translate to academically? I want to start with the good news because it's real and it's deserves an acknowledgement. On the strength side, we're seeing growth in some reading and science areas, not across the board, but specifically grade bands and specifically tested areas where other instructional focus over the past 2 years is starting to show up the numbers. The reading growth is evident the past years of year or two starting to show up on the numbers. The reading growth is evident among some specific student groups, which tells us that the target strategies, when we commit to them fully, do produce result here. That's an important data point to hold on as we get into the strategies later in the presentations, because it's evidence that its approach worked when we were following through on it. In consistency with what I said about mobility, our continuously enrolled students are clearly outperforming their more mobile peers. Our enforced that stability and consistency of the instruction generally matter for the population. Now, the area that needs our urgent attention, it's grade 7 math. Performance is notably low. This is the single most concerning data point in our entire need assessment, and it's a reason Objective 1.1 exists exactly as written. Our special education students show lower outcomes than the general population on both math and reading, and the gap isn't closing on its own year over year. It's persistence, which tells us that whatever general supports we had in place haven't been sufficient for the specific population. And most broadly, achievement gaps across several subpopulation remains consistent over time rather than narrowing, which tells us that general campus-wide instruction alone hasn't been enough. The bottom line of this is that it's really the thesis of everything that follows in these presentations. Math achievement and subpopulation gaps are the campus' two most urgent instructional priorities right now. Every objective and every strategy you know about to see traces directly back to one of these two findings. We didn't choose these two priorities because they are easy to address. Neither or one is easy. We chose them because the data told us clearly and repeatedly that this is what our students need us most. Let's go over goal one. Here's goal one in full, and I want to read slowly because every word in this SMART goal is intentional. By the end of 2027-2028 school year, all students will demonstrate academically proficiency by meeting grade level expectations on the STAR mathematic and reading assessments. Underneath the long-term goal, we have two specific measurable objectives for this year. Objective 1. By the end of 2026-2027, the percentage of grade 7 students meeting grade level expectations on STAR math will increase from baseline to 70%. I want to flag the word baseline. There's deliberately, we're not picking an arbitrary number out of the air. We're starting from exactly where our students are right now and setting the ambitious and achievable target about the starting point. Objective 1.2, closing achievement gaps. By the end of 2026-2027, the achievement gap between special education students and the general population will decrease by 10% points. This is a gap closing objective rather than a raw performance objective, which is important distinction. It means we're measuring success not just by whether special education students improve, but by whether the improvement fasting that the gap between them and their peers is shrinking, not just moving parallel. I want you to notice something important here. The two objective map directly one the two priorities area we're just looking to the previous slide. Math performance and subgroups gaps, nothing in the plan is arbitrary. If you trace any objective back far enough, it lands on a specific data point from our needs assessment. So now let's go deeper on grade 7 math, moving from baseline to 7% by the end of this year. We have three strategies driving this, and I want to walk through not just what each one is, but why we believe will it will be more specific number. Strategy 1 is benchmark meetings after every assessment cycle. So after each major benchmark throughout the year, we're bringing staff together and specifically to identify which students are not meeting standard. I want to be precise and about what it looks like in practice. It's not a generic review where we talk about scores in the actors. It's meeting where we pull up a list of specific students, write the name, look at which specific ticks each student missed, and walk out of the room with an actual plan for each student before the next benchmark. That's owned by the principal, the assistant principal, and the instructional coach, and our PLC leads, which means it has leadership accountability built directly into rather than me building then left into a chance. Strategy 2 is targeted small group intervention. Students who aren't meeting grade level standards get weekly focused intervention time. This is an extra homework or worksheet packet. It's dedicated to small group instruction time with a math teacher or intervention or instructional coach. Works directly with a small cluster of students on a specific skill. The data meeting identify. This weekly cadence matters here. The student doesn't wait until its next 9-week benchmark to get help. The support starts the same week the need is identified. And strategy 3 is a common formative. Our math department administers shared assessments and monitors progress at least every 3 weeks, which means we're never waiting until a big benchmark to find out whether a strategy is actually working or if the student isn't responding to a small group strategy. 2, we find out that within 3 weeks, not 9, there's a led by the department chair working closely with the classroom teachers who actually write and score the common assessments together, so we're comparing apples to apples across classrooms. But put together 3 strategies from a cycle rather than 3 separate initiatives. Data identify which students need help. Intervention actually delivers that help frequent. Common assessments check whether the help is processing and it's not looping back into the next data meeting so we can adjust. The tight cycle repeating every 3 weeks instead of every 9 is really the engine behind how we expect move from baseline to 70%. And now objective 2 is closing the achievement of subgroup between our special education students and the general population by 10%. Points on starting math and reading. Again, there is strategies, and I want to explain to you what it is and specific targets to get rather than just general performance. Strategy 1 is subgroup data monitoring. In our PLCs meeting, we're specifically pulling and reviewing performance data for our special education group subgroup to identify trends and adjust instructions. I want to be clear about this one. It's own dedicated strategy rather than instruction. Something we will assume happens automatically instead of general data review. When a subgroup data gets folded into overall class average, a handful of students who are struggling can get statistically buried by the rest of the class doing fine. Strategy 2 is strengthen MTSS support. For those who are less familiar with the acronym, MTSS is multi-tiered system of supports. It's a structure that determines what level of instruction students receive based on the need. Tier 1 is universal instruction through Tier 2 target small group, and then Tier 3 is intensive individualized intervention. This strategy especially works with Tier 2 and Tier 3. Supports for identified subgroups, meaning we're not just running the same generic intervention block for everyone. We're making sure the more intensive tiers are actually robust enough to serve students with more significant needs. And then strategy 3 is an individualized intervention plan, for each identified student gets a plan with a building progress, checks and achievement, check and active parent communications. So parent isn't finding out at the end of the year whether their child's plan worked. They're hearing about it along the way. That owns by a counselor, case managers, and teachers working together. So all these 3 strategies is intentionally. We're not hoping this gap closes as a side effect, but of general good instruction across building. every single strategy on the slide names the subgroup directly and build a specifically mechanism aimed at this population. That's a deliberate design choice because internal improvement on its own has not been sufficient to class. This is a particular gap in the past as we saw in the achievement patterns. I'm sorry. So now we're gonna talk about how we're gonna implement this strategies and the timeline and summative evaluation target for each goal. We're gonna start with the goal 1 strategy. This table is a quick reference. Summary, even strategy we just covered line up against its timeline and against how we'll know it worked. I encourage each of you to think of this slide less as new information and more as a single page you want it in front of you. If you were checking class progress in, say, February, for objective 1.1, benchmark data meeting happens after each benchmark and continues on an ongoing basis. As they're evaluated against end of the year star math performance compared to our baseline, small groups interventions will run quickly starting in the fall and continue through the spring benchmark window measured by the percentage of intervention students who go on to the meet standards. Common formative assessments happen every 3 weeks, and we evaluate them by comparing growth from fall to winter to spring, looking for an upward trend, not just a single good or bad data point. For objective 1.2, subgroup data monitoring happens bi-weekly in PLC meetings and rolls up into the end of the year disaggregated gap analysis, meaning we'll break the data apart by subgroup specifically rather than just looking at the campus-wide number. MTSS supports run from the very beginning of the year through the year end, and we measure success by the percentage of subgroup students who exit Tier 2 or Tier 3 support. In other words, students who needed intensive help and reach a point where they no longer needed an individualized intervention plan gets checked every 3 weeks on an ongoing basis, evaluated by a year end by comparing the subgroup performance against the campus-wide gap we're trying to close. I genuinely encourage this committee to hold onto the slide as we work reference throughout the year. If you want to check on this plan at any point before next spring, this is the page that tells you what should be happening when and where. So now monitoring and evaluation. So how does this actually get monitored in practice? Beyond the table we just looked at, 4 steps, and they're designed to build on each other across different timescales. First, formalist check. Our benchmark cycle and PLC meetings give us ongoing short-term evidence all year long. This is a close and frequent layer of monitoring happening every few weeks rather than waiting for a single end of the year snapshot. Second, leadership review. Campus leadership reviews implementation, evidence, and progress on a monthly basis. I want to underline the word implementation here. This isn't only asking whether scores are going up. It's asking whether the strategies themselves are actually happening as designed. Are the weekly small group sessions actually happening every week? Are the PLC subgroup conversations actually occurring bi-weekly? That's a different and equally important question from whether outcomes have improved yet. Third, summary evaluations at year end, where we step back and determine strategy by strategy whether which one met its stated objective. This is a formal comprehensive review that feeds directly into the next year planning. And fourth, and this is a place that keeps the entire plan alive rather than letting it become a static document. We revise strategies that work worked get extended into the next year, or even raise a higher bar. Strategies that didn't work get replaced rather than carry forward of a habit. This four-step cycle is exactly what this plan will simply get filed away in June and pull back on change next August. It's built to evolve based on what we're actually learning. Now, reflection. Before we look ahead, I want to pause and hear and reflect honestly on what we landed on this particular goal, because I think the reasoning behind a plan matters just as much as the plan itself, and this committee deserves transparency about that reasoning. First, the plan is grounded in data, not assumption. The 81.9 economically disadvantaged figure and dip in grade 7 math performance weren't things any of us guessed at or assumed based on instinct. They came directly out of a TAPR and our benchmark data. That evidence base is precisely why math comes first in this plan rather than, say, a subject area, where our instincts might have told us to focus, but the data didn't support it. Second, centering diverse learners, where we look closely at disaggregated data, our special education students and our highly modeled students showed the widest gaps of subgroups on this campus, wider than any other group we examined. Closing the average achievement gap campus-wide isn't enough in its average papers over these two specific groups continuing to fall behind. That's exactly why Objective 1.2 names a specific measurable target for special education students, rather than relying on overall school-wide improvement to eventually trickle down to them. Third, and I want to be candid about this rather than presenting this plan as flawless, what we do differently, our climate, staff, and technology data were incomplete this cycle. We didn't have a full picture in those areas as we did for academic performance. For a stronger, comprehensive need assessment next time, we need to start our climate survey and our classroom walkthroughs data collection earlier in the fall, rather than scrambling to gather it later in this year. And there's less time to act what we find. I'm sure that not to undercut confidence in the plan, but because I think this committee should know we're already thinking about how to make next year's need assessment even more complete. Now, future plans. This is where it gets fun. Beyond this school year is if the objective is met and if it's not. Looking beyond the school year, we deliberately plan for both possible outcomes here, because a plan that only describes what happens is if everything goes well, isn't actually a complete plan. If we meet the target, first we raise the bar. Next year's grade 7 math objective would move from 70% towards something more rigorous, for example, 80%. So success this year becomes the floor for next year rather than the ceiling. Second, we sustain what worked. If benchmark data meaning prove to be real driver for the results, they continually largely unchanged rather than getting redesigned just for the sake of change. Third, we expand scope. Successful math strategies could extend to other grades levels beyond 7th, or to other content areas beyond math, since a strategy that works for one group of students and one subject often transfer well to others. If we don't meet the target first, we're going to investigate why, with this committee specifically examining the implementation evidence we discussed in the monitoring slide. Was the strategy actually delivered as designed, on schedule, with fidelity? The questions came before we decide anything else. Second, we revise rather than repeat. We don't simply carry an ineffective strategy forward into next year, unchanged just because it's already written down. Third, we narrow the focus, identifying the specific takes, the specific skills, or the specific subgroups is still struggling, and targeting professional development and resources directly at the point of need rather than spreading effort thin across everything at once. I think it's worth saying plainly, this committee role doesn't end today. Whichever path we are on by next spring, the structure for revisiting and adjusting this plan is already built in, and your continued involvement in the review is part of how this states in a living plan rather than one-time presentation. Before I close, I want to bring all this back to what actually changed for a student, because every adult action described in this plan exists in service of a specific concrete outcome, and I think it's worth slowing down on the slide rather than rushing through it. When teachers analyze benchmark data every 3 weeks, a struggling student gets identified within the weeks of falling behind, not at year end when there no time to intervene before the start test. That timing difference is a difference between catching problem early, enough to fix it, and discover it too late and matter. When a small group math intervention happens weekly, a student below grade level gets sustained target instruction matched to the specific skill they're missing, not just more repetition of an approach that already wasn't working for them at the first time around. When MTSS supports our strength for our subgroups, our special education students, and our economically disadvantaged students get a monitor path toward grade level performance, not just a general sense that someone is keeping an eye on them. And when coaching cycle focus specifically on differentiation, improve teacher practices, and classrooms translate directly into more students actually accessing grade level content during the regular school day, rather than only catching up during the separate intervention time. Every box on this slide is really a chain of which student at the end of it. A real student in a classroom at Tennyson getting something this year that they weren't reliably getting before. That's ultimately what the entire plan is for. So this brings us together. This campus will use this goal, its objective, and its strategy to drive measurable growth in student achievement. This year, grounded in real data rather than assumptions, sharply focus on our highest need students, and build with a clear recurring plan to monitor progress and revise course as we go rather than waiting until next year to find out whether it's worked. Thank you for your time, your attention, and role you played on this committee in shaping how this plan moves forward. I'd love to open the floor now for your questions and discussions.